So when we are done with basic toon shaders, we are going to get some basic knowledge of Blender's render engines. So there are 3 render engines in Blender, which are Eevee, Cycles and Workbench. Each one of them works very differently as needed. So in Eevee and Cycles, we can render different render passes to control our render output in Compositor. With Eevee we will create the base shaders and texture for our objects and scenes. After that we head over to the Workbench and we will set it to the flat mode. And then we turn on the cavity. We will set cavity mode to both, so we can get cavity results on object and world base. When we do that we will get these 4 sliders to control the cavity results. There are no particular values for that, we have to adjust it on different scenes with different settings and values. I usually use standard color mode for better color grade in render, but I am changing it to filmic so we can see the effects of our values. So as you can see the cavities of the cube on the edges, which is what we want to use in the Compositor. So in the last video there are different types of methods to create outlines. You can create outlines with the Workbench engine as well. We just have to check the outline checkmark. And now some outlines over our whole scene. The outlines are not visible too much because of the contrast of our scene. And finally the Cycles render engine, which we are going to use to get some light effects on our scene. We head over to Cycles, we will get to the passes properties over there. Then we are going to make a new object and add a new material over it, and name it whatever you like. I am renaming it as default. Now in passes properties you have to scroll down to get the override drop-down menu, where we have to search for the default menu. After choosing the default shader, all of the objects of our scene will get the same shader we choose, which is going to be really helpful for our render. As you can see we still have the original shader over our objects, but Blender overrided with the shader we created. So now we can use Cycles render engine lighting for our scene. Because if we are going to use Eevee lighting, the light color will not affect the object shader, because we already decided the colors for our object in shading. You can see it's affecting our object as we are getting the highlights over our object, but we are not getting the effect of light colors on our object. So as we learn to use the 3 render engine basic workflow for our scene, we are going to implement it. So as I told you before, we are going to use Eevee for shading and texturing, Cycles for ray tracing, lighting and Workbench for cavity effects. Now to render our scene we needed a camera. So now we are going to put our light source to a different collection, so we can differentiate between the lights we are going to use in different render engines. And now I am renaming it as Eevee lighting. So now we are going to create a linked copy of our scene. So when we click here we will get a bunch of options, and we are going to use a linked copy. With the linked copy method, if we change anything in the collection, it will change an original scene as well, which is really helpful and an easy way to work with. Now we get a copy of our scene as scene.001. But if you click at that icon you can see all the existing scenes in our Blender project file. Let's call it Cycles and change the render engine to Cycles. And turn down the samples because it will take too much time to render that much of samples, and we don't need that much. Now we are turning off the Eevee lighting collection. Keep that in that mind, we are not going to delete anything in the linked copy scene because it will affect our original scene. Now we are creating a new collection of Cycles lighting. Now we will add some basic lighting for our scene. Now we only use pure colors to light our scene, so we can control it in the Compositor easily. So I am changing that color to red. Now just add 2 more lights with pure colors. Let's change scene setting to transparent background, and do this over our Eevee scene as well. So time to render it. Now we are getting a bunch of cavities on our object because I forgot to increase the subdivs in render mode. Now it's fine. Now let's jump to the Compositor tab. Your Compositor tab will look different, something like that. You just have to create another panel and change it to an image editor window. And select the viewer node. And now click on Use Nodes and disable the backdrop. Just duplicate those nodes and drag it somewhere. So if you have Node Wrangler add-in enabled in Blender, so just have to click Ctrl Shift and left click and a viewer node will appear and automatically connect with your render layer node. So now we are going to import the render of the linked copy scene we created. When you zoom on the render layer node, you can see there is the name of our original scene. And we will duplicate the render layer node, and if you click on scenes icon we have another scene we created. Now we are going to select the cycles scene and click on that render current layer icon to render our cycles scene. Now it's done rendering and we can use that render in our compositor now. So we have to separate that light information. So we are going to use separate color node. So after dragging it to our layer we have different sets of light values. We use pure colors RGB so we can separate them here easily. Keep that in mind, every light color is going to be added with our scene. So we will add a mix RGB node and change it to add and just join the red channel to our mix RGB bottom color. As you can see, it's affecting our object and we try to control it with a color ramp. We can even change the color of the lights here. Now let's use other lights as well. Just duplicate the color ramp and join the other colors channels to it. Now we will add them with mix RGB node. Now we can play with colors. So if we want to increase the strength of our light, we can use the hue saturation node and increase the value. So after that, let's jump on the Workbench render engine with creating another linked copy of our scene. Now we have themes. Change those settings to 32-bit for clean results. And we all other settings. Let's render it. Note that after render have to go to the original scene and then compositor. So now we are going to import the render layer of our workbench scene in our compositor. So we get the render of our third scene in our compositor, but we have to control the effects with a color ramp to add this to our scene. They are working fine, but there are really very harsh lines. So we are going to use filter node to smooth it out.